Good afternoon. My name is Mathias Risse, and I'm the director of the Carr Center for Human Rights Policy at the Harvard Kennedy School. And it is my pleasure, also on behalf of my colleague Sushma Raman, to welcome our distinguished speaker and also, of course, you, our audience, to this week's episode in our series on the fierce urgency of now. On a weekly basis, this series addresses challenges that one way or another are matters of economic justice. The broader context for today's event is Marxism, a set of ideas that over the last 2 centuries has persistently called out certain pathologies of capitalism. Marxism has given rise to an enormous body of work that developed the ideas into multiple directions and has had an enormous impact on the world through the creation of communist governments across countries, and also through its inspiration for the less radical and broader tradition of democratic socialism. But those of you who wish to have a fresh encounter with the original ideas of Karl Marx should actually just pick up his 1844 economic and philosophical manuscripts, in which he lays out his basic critiques of capitalism, that it exploits people and thus leads to an unwarranted transfer of the products and income from labor, that it alienates people from the richness of human possibilities that cannot materialize in a social world driven by self-interest rather than community and humanity, and that it commodifies as much as it gets away with, which leads to an impoverished experience of nature, of the social world, and really everything also that humans produce, because all of that is only seen through the lens of a price mechanism. What had not quite happened when Marx himself, at least in the early stages of his writing, when he diagnosed these failures, was capitalism's global expansion through imperialism, which then, in addition to the domination of the ownership class over the working class in industrialized countries, intensified the domination by the global north of regions in the global south. Though Marxism has been severely criticized for the political regimes it has given rise to, one persistent response to that line of criticism has always been that capitalism, imperialism, and all the devastation of human potential they continue to generate should only make us think harder about how one could create a world free from exploitation, free from alienation, free from commodification, and free from imperialist domination. Marxists believe that capitalism crushes the human spirit and that we need to do better and that also we can do better. Our title for today is Washington Bullets, a conversation with Vijay Prashad about Marxism today and the role of the United States in the world. And it is now my pleasure to introduce to you Vijay Prashad, one of the globally most visible Marxist intellectuals and activists. Based in Delhi, Beirut, and Northampton is where he is connecting to from, and a historian by training, Professor Prashad is a prolific writer and an editor of books, essays, and articles, so prolific also on the web that in fact he has been called the radical spam of social media. In his work, he has re-articulated Marxist ideals around community, humanity, and solidarity for the present age, always especially with an eye on ending the domination of countries in the global south. In his historical work, he has not only drawn attention to these mechanisms of domination, but also to the richness and complexity of political activism, protest, and political thought in countries in the global south. In particular, he resists the view that left political thought originates in the global north and that the rest of the world has only been able to add guerrilla manuals. His works remind us of episodes in the heyday of international political organizing in the global south, such as the New International Economic Order from the 1970s, of which many people who learn about history in the global north have never heard. He has also been a rather outspoken critic of US foreign policy as a foreign policy that aims for domination. He recently posted on his Twitter, "Man says to me, Marxism-Leninism is anachronistic. I say, but I am alive." So let me start right in with the questions. The phrase Washington Bullets in the title actually is the title also of the Vijay, your forthcoming book, Washington Bullets, and it's in turn taken from a song by The Clash in their 1980s album Sandinista. To give us a sense of where you are at this stage, can you tell us why you chose this title and what your new book is about?
Well, first, Sushma, Mathias, great to be with you on the platform of the Carr Center for Human Rights and, of course, Harvard University. It's a real pleasure. Yes, it's true. I'm alive. And not just me, but hundreds of millions of people who share the basic orientation that I wanted to capture in this book called Washington Bullets. Firstly, people need to go and listen to The Clash. I'm not sure if they have transferred into the new generations, but the album Sandinista has got to be one of the best albums there is. And particularly for the pandemic, when you're stuck at home, play it really loudly to impress your parents. So there's that. Last year, when there was a coup d'etat in Bolivia against the government of Evo Morales, this was a very significant event. Morales had been the head of the government of the movement to socialism for 14 years. And during this period, basic statistics of human life had improved. Bolivia is a place that had been taken advantage of for centuries, ever since the conquistadors got there and began to basically mine it of silver, later of tin and so on. But Morales, the first real government in Bolivian history to try to use, let's call it resource socialism, to turn over the wealth of the country to improve the life of mainly indigenous people who populate Bolivia. Life expectancy improved, educational levels improved, and so on. In his last UN address, in fact, Morales laid out a list of improvements, unchallenged improvements. The United Nations verifies that most of that data is good data, that it's indeed the case that people were living longer, they were eating better, their lives had improved during Morales's government. And yet there was this precipitous coup that took place, which was conducted through allegations of fraud brought by the Organization of American States, which, even though a multilateral body based in Washington, D.C., takes many of its inspiration from the US State Department. And I don't think that's a controversial statement. I think it's pretty clear that they clear things with the State Department. And so that coup, which took place between the election of the 21st of October and the eventual leaving of Mr. Morales, several weeks later, when an army officer goes into his office and says, you better leave. This army officer essentially trained in the United States. Morales goes to Mexico and is now in Argentina. That impacted me enormously because it reminded me in every detail of the coup process that was brought against Jacob Arbenz of Guatemala in 1954. It was almost identical to the coup against Mohammad Mossadegh in Iran in 1953. There were echoes of the coup against Salvador Allende, which took place over 3 years between 1970 and 73 in Chile. There, the issue was copper. In Bolivia, the issue was lithium, it was indium, and it was how dare this fellow conduct a policy of resource socialism. And so really quite convulsed by this episode. And I am, I know these people in the Mas and Morales and so on, and I was really stunned at how sensitive people in the United States were basically walking around saying, he conducted fraud, he's been there too long, he needs to leave. As if you have any constitutional role in the future of an elected person in Bolivia. I mean, let's just stay with basic liberal understandings. Bolivia has a constitution, they have an election. What does it matter what the impressions of an American are regarding the electoral process in Bolivia? Strikes me itself to be an act of extra liberal arrogance, if I can put it like that. Turns out, as 4 American political scientists and 2 from MIT showed, there was no fraud in that election. Quite conclusively looking at the data from the Election Commission, they showed there's no fraud. Unfortunately, their findings came out months after Morales had been removed. So I sat down from December onwards and wrote this book at a lightning speed because I felt that an entire generation needs to have a concise book that shows them how these things are done. The middle section of the book is a manual for regime change. It comes in 9 pieces. It explains how these regime change operations take place. And I'll just say that the entire book is sourced by the CIA archive and by long interviews I conducted with former CIA officials, including one of them in Harvard Square, where I sat over several days with Chuck Cogan, who was the head of CIA operations from Afghanistan to essentially North Africa, based for a time in Tehran, then based, of course, at Langley. Chuck Cogan, who even in a warm day would come in a big coat, and I was always afraid he was carrying a gun because he told me all kinds of things. Chuck, lovely man, God knows what horrible things he oversaw because he was there in the 1970s. And I had gone there interested in the assassination of a US ambassador in Afghanistan, and I would love to talk about that at some point, but perhaps not now. So the book is sourced with CIA sourcing. It's not what I'm, alleging. It's what the CIA says itself. And this is how they conduct coups. And what happened to Morales, therefore, QED, if this is what the history is like, QED, this looks a lot like a normal, run-of-the-mill, bread and butter coup d'etat.
So just to be clear then, the Washington bullets in the title of that book, they are actual real bullets. This is in the Sandinista song, this is not meant metaphorically.
Well, yes. And in fact, as I say in the book, the bullets are perhaps crafted in Washington, but not always fired by somebody with a US passport. So, when Lumumba is killed in the Democratic Republic of Congo in 1961, he's not killed by a CIA agent directly, but that's a bullet that was polished slightly by Langley. When Thomas Sankara is killed in 1987, that bullet is also polished a little bit. And we have seen, for instance, and my God, Chuck told me some hair-raising stories. We have seen lesser known people just removed from the planet Earth because they're inconvenient. When Jacob Arbenz was being removed from Guatemala, sent to Mexico, he was stripped naked in the airport in Guatemala City on the way out, humiliated. And he died in a bathtub in Mexico City. He entered a scalding hot bathtub and burned to death. Now, his wife had always alleged that he was murdered in his bath. It's very unlikely that a human being will willingly enter a bathtub of scalding hot water and essentially burn themselves. So, I mean, there is no metaphor in the title, Washington. I'm sorry to say this, it's not with great glee and pleasure that I say this, because I know some of the people who were at the wrong end of those bullets. And I've met their families, and it's a moment, I think, for people to pause, that a lot of blood was spilled, whether it's the million people in Indonesia after 1965 coup led by Suharto. It's a lot of people killed in Brazil after the US engineered coup in 1964, a coup that lasted 21 years. A lot of people were killed in the Southern Cone, in Chile, in Argentina. I've met a number of the families. I've met people who've been tortured, who were tortured by the junta in Argentina. It's a very, very ugly history. And I think sensible civics classes in the United States are doing an injustice to their students because they don't teach them the actual facts of what happens in their name.
Let me just, since you mentioned this in passing, the Indonesia massacre, I don't want to talk about this in greater detail, but just to bring this to the attention of the audience again, this is something that you should all Google if you haven't heard of it before. Indonesia massacre from the mid-1960s. In the early Suharto time. This is exactly the kind of example where the perception of history that we get in schools in the global north is leaving out important and very painful episodes like that. But let's move on. So so far, I mean, everything you said so far about the the role of bullets in American foreign policy, to that extent, the role of the United States in the world. You could say, without saying anything that comes specifically from Marxism, from communism, and yet this is where you're grounded, right? This is your intellectual home. For example, one of the talks then by you that one can find online is called "The Necessity of Communism." Could you elaborate on that a little bit? Why is communism necessary? What is it necessary for?
Yes, I mean, this particular book, and you're quite right. I mean, any sensitive person should be outraged by, the use of force in this way to get your political ends established. So the grounding for Washington bullets, in a sense, is sensitivity, I would hope. If you're a sensitive person, you would be really quite saddened by the way the world was made. And this is not the distant past. As I said, this is yesterday. This is Bolivia in October, November 2019. On the other side, there's also another kind of, I'm going to use some hard words, another kind of authoritarianism that is in place. And that's the authoritarianism of money. So I'll just give you a very simple, basic problem that we face. In the world, we know from studies done by the Food and Agricultural Organization of the UN, the World Food Program of the UN, we know that food production in the world is considerable, that in fact there's enough food on the planet to feed everybody. We know that because they've done the studies, they've looked at what's there. And I'm not talking about the fact that only 10% of arable land in the DRC, Democratic Republic of Congo, is farmed. I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about the actual food production now, not the potential food production. If the Congo, for instance, is better harnessed and so on. I'm not talking about that. Actual food production is sufficient for everybody on the planet. And yet, perhaps 1 billion people starve every day. 1 billion people, perhaps. During the pandemic, we think that might have doubled to close to 2 billion people. Yesterday, the International Labour Organization released a report which showed that the working class of the world lost $3.5 trillion of income in the past 6 months. Okay, let me repeat that number. $3.5 trillion lost by the working class of the world, 10.7% decline in income of people. It's just an enormous cut that people have taken. And this is, of course, very uneven. So in the northern societies, it's about a 9% drop. In the poorer countries, it's about a 13 to 14% drop. Very considerable drop in people's incomes. So what I'd say is, on the one side, you have enough food and it's in a warehouse or it's in a grocery store. On the other side, you have 1 billion, maybe 2 billion people who are hungry. Now, what prevents the hungry people from getting access to this food? What prevents them from getting access to the food isn't the availability of food. This is not a demand side problem. This is not really a supply side problem. It's a neither demand nor supply, because you both have demand and you have supply. This is a money problem. The fact is that 2 billion people just don't have the income to buy food. So now I would like you, forget Marxism, forget anything. I want you to explain to me, what is the theory you have that explains the fact that 2 billion people, or if we're being conservative, 1 billion people, that's a lot of people. Explain to me how 1 billion people can go hungry when we have enough food supply in the world. It's not a question of the supply chains are broken, food is not getting to them. It's sitting on a shelf right in front of them. They just don't have the money for it. And then that raises the next question. Why don't they have the money for it? Because they're dispossessed. Well, they're dispossessed. What was the more you ask these questions, Mathias, the more you enter this, you begin to understand that capitalism produces deprivation. It produces hunger. It produces poverty. And it's that led me, as on a personal note, that's what led me to Marxism. Because Marxism broke it down for me to that extraordinarily simple. And I'm very glad you mentioned the Paris manuscripts of 1844, the economic and political manuscripts, because in that text, Marx, a very young Marx in his 30s, is coming to terms with just this question. When he was much younger in Germany, he wrote, I think, one of his finest youthful pieces of writing. He was writing about the woods in Prussia, Silesia maybe, where the local government had declared that the poor or anybody couldn't go into the forest and collect firewood. And this had been a practice for, at least 100 years, maybe more. People would just walk into the forest, collect dry wood that had fallen, limbs that had fallen. They weren't cutting trees, and then come out carrying, the wood. And then that was their, and they were being shot by the police now and beaten because there was a law saying you're not allowed to get this wood. So Marx, this very young man in his 20s, asks a question. He says, or not as an observation, he observes, the people of Silesia, I think it's Silesia, the people of Silesia know their punishment. They understand their punishment. Their punishment is they're getting beaten, or some of them are getting killed. They're getting shot, cutlasses used against them. They know their punishment. What they don't know is their crime. They don't understand the crime. What did they do? They just collected wood from the floor. See, hungry people today on the planet, Mathias, understand their punishment. They are being punished to starve. They don't understand their crime. And their crime is they don't have money. So if a top economist can explain to me, give me a better explanation of why it is a crime not to have money. Explain to me why generations of families, in a family over generations, people are penalized for being dispossessed. If you can give me a better explanation than Marxism, I'll consider it. I'm not saying I'm going to take it, but I'll consider it.
I have a follow-up question on that, but before I ask that, let me actually make a quick movie recommendation to the audience, since you spoke about that wood collecting issue that Marx was working on at the early stages of his journalistic career. There's a wonderful movie about the young Karl Marx. In fact, that's what it's called, The Young Karl Marx, which actually starts exactly with that topic, and it's a drama, so it's not a documentary, it's a story being told, but it's actually also, as far as the philosophical content and the political background issues are concerned, quite accurate. It's really very much worth watching, and I'm sure you can get that fairly easily in various outlets online. But as a follow-up on that, so you say the crime that they're committing is that they're poor, and so Marxism, communism makes sense of that and shows the way forward, right? So one response to that one often hears is something like this: look, Marxism has been tried, right? So after the revolution that led to the founding of the Soviet Union, we have had Marxism there, and we have had a number of other satellite countries of the Soviet Union. Was tried in China, was tried in a number of other countries, and basically they have all pretty much changed their course by now. And to the extent that they haven't changed their course, it's not something we're aspiring to. So in other words, the point here is to say the real lived experience of socialism and communism has been rather negative. Capitalism, yes, has many horrible features, but it's the kind of thing that we understand and we can work with. We have to improve, but it's about improving on the margins, more emancipation, yes, of course, but let's not throw it out altogether. What is your take on that response?
Yeah, I mean, there's just a few things, I think, and let's leave them as observations. The first one is that every country since the revolution against the Tsarist Empire, every country that's had a Marxist or a communist revolution has been a terribly poor country. Whether it's been, as I said, the Tsarist Empire, Mongolia, the Second Revolution, Vietnam, 1945 revolution, China, 49, Cuba, 59. I mean, you name it. They're all basically in extremely poor contexts, countries that had been colonized or had been in some ways struggling with poverty and with largely agricultural populations. For these countries, it's always been an experiment to build socialism. There was no revolution in Germany or in the United Kingdom or in the United States, countries with a lot of wealth where the wealth could have been socialized and interesting things could have been done in these countries. There was no communist revolution in these countries. The closest you got was in East Germany, where you did have a government, it wasn't exactly a revolution, it was more as a consequence of World War II. But I'll come back to that in a minute. So that's the first thing people need to recognize, is that these Marxism has, in a sense, both had a great history in the world by pushing forward an agenda in very poor countries, and secondly, it's been penalized for that, because after all, it is difficult to create, a modern society in a society wretchedly deprived, as say China in 1949. Secondly, let's take China in 1949. Let's compare China to India. India wins its independence in 1947. China has a revolution in 1949. If today I was to ask a poor person in India or in China, or let's not ask one because that's idiosyncratic, let's be proper and let's do surveys of 100 Indians and 100 Chinese people, and let's swap them for 6 months. How many people would want to go back home? I'll guarantee you that the 100 Indians that moved to China and experienced Chinese level poverty would much rather remain in China. In India, a McKinsey study showed that perhaps 800 million Indians live in deprivation. I mean, for a country of 1.3 billion, that's a lot of people. That's 1 in 2 Indians. China, just in this last period, has lifted hundreds of millions of people out of poverty. There is no question that what the Chinese have been able to do has been extraordinary, particularly in the early period when they were able to bring education, land reform, healthcare, and so on. There is just no comparison in the statistics between India and China. Now, somebody can turn around, and this is the third observation, and say that, look, after 1978, China is no longer a socialist country. People often say that. I don't agree with that at all. And here's the interesting bits of evidence. One, the level of state investment to lift people out of poverty is unbelievable. I mean, you take the amounts of money that the Chinese have put into transfer payments and infrastructural development, state funded, mind you, not in this neoliberal era, private public partnerships and so on. This is entirely state funded operation. You compare that to India. I mean, the Indian attempts at poverty alleviation are miserable in comparison. Look at the pandemic, in India, the government just said to the day laborers, sayonara, see ya. Overnight, people had to walk hundreds of kilometers back to their homes. People died walking home. They had no money because they were day laborers, they live hand to mouth per day. In China, the government just turned over massive infrastructure towards making sure that people were getting fed and so on. And I mean, I look at this very closely because my team and I study the Chinese situation very, very closely. And we've been looking recently at transfer payments in China. We've been looking closely at what they've been doing in the they are already in a kind of post-pandemic situation. And the level of state intervention into the economy is, I mean, it's incredible if you imagine. It's exactly what the Trump administration is complaining about. You have it in a funny way. You have people in the elites in the United States who say, well, China is not really socialist. And then you have them complaining there's too much state intervention in the economy. Well, I think state intervention in the economy in the way that it's done, which is really a kind of people first approach, is a good way to start thinking about socialism. Yes, there have been catastrophic things that have happened in the past. In China itself, the Cultural Revolution, I think, was a catastrophic event. I think that was, not something that one should look at and say, everything that happens in the USSR or GDR isn't great. On the other hand, Mathias, I was going to end on the GDR. On the other hand, no socialist society can be shown to have not taken seriously the social question. And let's just take women's rights. The first Soviet constitution onward, women's rights has been taken extremely seriously. From the first Soviet constitution, women were given the franchise. There was no suffragette movement inside the Russian Communist Party. They just agreed to it. And what you saw in the GDR was an extraordinary advance in male-female relations, in household management. Thomas Sankara in Burkina Faso in 1984 decreed, as part of his Marxist agenda, that every Wednesday, only once a week, he said, mind you, as a beginning, every Wednesday, women will not work in social reproductive labor. They will not take care of their children. They will not take them to school. They will not cook. They will not wash. They will not do anything. One day in the week, he said, as a beginning, men have to learn by decree to take care of their children and take care of their homes. I don't see any capitalist society attempting the social question with this kind of seriousness, even, I mean, especially in the GDR, that is East Germany.
Right. So since you now both spoke both about China and the GDR, let me just follow up on these points. So I completely agree that there's a lot of that there's this triumphalist capitalist way of looking at history, where you're looking at these these various versions of socialism and communism, and you only focus on the negative things, and you're not acknowledging that there have been enormous accomplishments. And in the case of China, of course, this is obvious with the lifting people out of poverty. And there's a bit debatable to what extent this is coming, how this comes in. But let's leave that aside. What is striking, though, both about China and the GDR, is that these are regimes with a very intense level of state surveillance, right? So the GDR had the Stasi, the state security, which had the combination of official and informal people working for them, at just about 300,000 for a population of about 16 million, whereas Hitler's Gestapo, scared, fear into everybody's hearts and minds for a population of 80 million with just 8,000, right? So the level of state surveillance in the GDR was absolutely extraordinary. And of course, China, one of the biggest things that gives us headaches about China these days is that they have been building this massive social scoring system using data from everybody's electronic devices. So is this something that if we were sympathetic to communism on economic justice grounds, lifting people out of poverty and emancipating, this is all great, but do we have to put up with this level of state surveillance as just the flip side that's implied?
You see, Mathias, interestingly, modern societies have a predilection for state surveillance. It is interesting how Mike Pompeo is on a world mission to warn everybody about how Huawei, the 5G, the telecommunications company, which is Taiwanese, based in, does many operations in the People's Republic of China. Mike Pompeo is on a world, journey, saying Huawei is going to steal your data and your privacy will be violated and so on. It's fascinating to watch this happen, because you'll remember there was an NSA contractor, National Security Agency contractor by the name of Edward Snowden. And you'll also remember Snowden released, when he was in Hong Kong, to Glenn Greenwald and Laura Poitras and others, a whole bunch of documents which he had taken from the NSA. And what Snowden had showed was that the NSA and the US government runs a program which essentially is a pipeline program to Silicon Valley firms, and they had various interesting names. And people can go on the web and just look at the slideshow that Snowden brought out with him. You don't have to read all the documents, just look at the slideshow. It's incredible. We have tangible evidence that US-based multinational tech companies routinely provide information, private information of people who use these systems, to the US government, particularly the NSA, which, we hear that there are 21,000 employees, but that's direct employees. We know that Snowden is a contractor. Nobody knows, Mathias, how many people work effectively for the NSA. It's 21,000 people who work in that building, near Washington, DC, but Snowden was based in Hawaii. I don't know how many NSA posts there are, how many contract, we have no idea. Okay, so so now I'm supposed to trust the US government and Western, snooping, because that's benign. But they've built up this thing about, the Stasi listening to you. I'll give you an example. Some years ago, I was going to give a talk, a public speech in Chicago against the Iraq war. I took the morning flight in and I took the evening flight out from Chicago. This is the same event where, no, I don't know if it's the same event, but, Barack Obama as a state senator spoke at many of these kind of events. Anyway, when I arrived in the airport in Chicago to leave, there were two FBI agents there, to ask me what I was doing and so on. And I've frequently had an interaction with the bureau, because they like to know, what are you up to these days? So I'm always interested in this idea that over there, state surveillance was appalling. Over here, it's, I think modern states have a serious problem with distrust of the citizenry. I don't think this is a communist versus capitalist issue at all. I think this is a modern state problem. And therefore, I feel like when we advance our, social development, we must advance beyond the need to have surveillance of our fellow citizens. I'm not saying there was no Stasi. As you can see, I'm not denying anything to you. I admit that there's a serious problem modern states have, but all of them have it. And we need to find a way. It is very difficult, Mathias, to have any society in the world today where you have an apparatus created to operate on behalf of the public, which also trusts the public. We haven't created an effective system where you have both representative government and trust of the government. I mean, look at that incident with Joe Biden in Iowa, where a man in a meeting raised some objections, and Biden accused him of being a Trump supporter and went up to him and was quite aggressive with him. I mean, what's the need? The man is asking you a question. You accuse him of being a Trump supporter. You try to intimidate him physically. I mean, and you see what Trump did the other day. He says it's a good thing journalists get roughed up. I mean, that's extraordinary. How do we create a society where we both have representative government of one kind or the other and trust in the public? And I don't think anybody solved that issue. So it's that reason why I don't say, let's take an Abrahamic position to judge the GDR. There is no God position. There is nobody with credibility to judge any other state right now on state surveillance. I think we all need to struggle together to figure out how to trust people, especially governments trusting their citizens.
So I'm going to ask you one more question, and I'm going to turn over to Sushma, but people in the audience should also feel free to put your questions in the YouTube channel, and Sushma will be bringing them in then also. So my last question to you before turning over is, so you have often in your writing and in your speeches, you have spoken about American fascism, which is a bit of a, for many people will be a bit of a tough idea to stomach, because certainly the American self-understanding is such that we have beaten fascism. Fascism is this other thing. So we emerge from that war, in the middle of the 20th century, victorious, defeating both fascism and communism. We did that. The greatest generation did that. And now you come along a few decades later and you say, well, actually, this is kind of different. And you yourself, America itself, is a practitioner of fascism. So what is American fascism, and how, why is the United States guilty of that?
I mean, it's a polemical term, let's face it, okay? The word fascism is used polemically, and yes, I'm guilty. Sometimes I use it polemically, but let's also be a little specific about it. Aimé Césaire, one of the very great politicians and poets of the 20th century, wrote a poem called Discourse on Colonialism shortly after World War II, in which he starts by saying, you in Europe are surprised by, Hitler, and you're surprised by the Holocaust, which is a horrible thing. I mean, Césaire is not one to minimize the horror of the Holocaust or the appalling nature of the Nazi regime, but he says, you are surprised by this. But he says, we are not. I mean, imagine the Congo, where Belgian rule had, in the course of 10 years, 6 million people killed. Workers had to go into the rubber plantations, with around their neck hanging a limb from their friend, whose limb was cut off and hung around your neck to motivate you to work harder. The compounds of the Belgians had skulls all around it, grotesque, right? At a high level, grotesque. King Leopold II's Congo was a grotesquerie, and people should know about that. So you say from Césaire says, we've already experienced the Holocaust, by multitudes. And then you take the United States and say, you're pointing fingers there. But meanwhile, look at the history. I mean, you've almost exterminated an entire people, Native Americans. Look at that history. In Hitler's Mein Kampf, he writes and says, look, if the Americans can do it to create Lebensraum, In other words, free space. And he references directly the extermination or near extermination of Native Americans. He said, you have done that there. We want to do this in Poland and, with the Slavs. I mean, he says, we will do first Anschluss and then Lebensraum will be created. And his reference is the United States, not anywhere else. And then after that, the enslavement of human beings for profit, grotesque part of the history. And then the inability to come to terms with that. I mean, the killing of George Floyd, how different is that to the lynching period? How different is that, where you have police departments, not one police officer here, another police officer there. You see, if it was just a few cases, then you could put it down to, well, it's just this police officer. It's a structural thing. There's something in the structure. There is a kind of incipient hatred of certain people. And you, again, the phrase is you want their labor, you don't want their lives. You want African Americans to come and do certain jobs, but you don't want them to exist, it seems, the way they are treated. So let's have a serious accounting of this within the United States and then outside. I mean, look at this, okay? What is this behavior? And I don't know how to categorize it. Maybe calling it fascist is a bit polemical and absurd. Look at this behavior. An American president has a scandal because he has violated propriety. I don't know if he broke a law, but he violated propriety having a sexual relationship with an intern. This is going to break in the news. What does that American president do? He bombs the only pharmaceutical factory in Sudan, the Al-Shifa factory in Khartoum. The only pharmaceutical factory is bombed by an American president to distract from news of a scandal in his administration. I mean, what term, how should I describe that action? How should the Sudanese understand that action? And they also bombed Afghanistan that same day with cruise missiles, saying we are going to hit an Al-Qaeda camp. Maybe they hit an Al-Qaeda camp. I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about the pharmaceutical company, that factory. And by the way, Sudan today still doesn't have the capacity to create its own pharmaceuticals because of that bombardment in 1998. How shall I describe this? Again, I welcome people to give me a better description. And I shall admit and perhaps apologize. Maybe fascist is too polemical, but give me another way to describe this. It doesn't just happen once, Al-Shifa and Khartoum. It doesn't just happen once. It seems to happen punctually, over and over again. And if something happens more than once, it's got to be structural and not just conjunctural. If it happens once, it's in the conjuncture, it's in the moment, it's in the event. And so then you can say, well, look, it's an unusual thing. If it happens punctually, if there are many, many conjunctures which are identical, then you have to wonder, it must be structural. This is a methodology issue. If it's structural, how do we describe the structure? Is it utter callousness toward the world and the world's well-being? Because after all, you bombed a pharmaceutical factory. It's not Monty Python, fellas. It's not like they didn't know exactly what they were bombing. I just cannot believe that. I cannot believe it because they wanted to punish the government of Omar Bashir. I feel they must have. How could they not? And do you know what? In the Khartoum phone book in 1998, the address of the factory is available.
So thank you, Vijay. I'm going to take it over at this point. And I'm struck by a couple things you said where at one point you said that distrust in the citizenry is really a feature of the modern state. You say it's not really communist or capitalist, but at the same time, several of the phenomena you talk about here, economic injustice, exploitation, resource extraction, treatment of specific groups are really universal to the human condition. So I'm wondering what you would say about China's treatment of the Uyghurs. So not just sort of surveillance of all citizens, but really like specific ethnic groups, and what your thoughts are in terms of China's role in, not just sort of providing for poverty alleviation, but also ensuring sort of dignity of all people.
Yeah, so, I mean, I don't know enough about the Uyghurs, and I haven't traveled to Western China, but I have some thoughts about it. And I'm happy to share at least 3 or 4 ideas. But again, I have no direct experience. And, most of my career I've spent as a journalist, and I make it a point to go and verify things. So the things I've talked about, Bolivia, Sudan, these are things I know fairly well. So I don't know this well, and it's not like I know everything about everything. So really take what I'm saying with a grain of salt. I could be quite wrong. The first thing is, I am suspicious about the United States' interest in the Uyghurs. I am suspicious when I hear Mike Pompeo and Mike Pence position themselves as defenders of Muslims. This makes me suspicious because this strand of the United States elite is decidedly anti-Muslim. I mean, these are the Muslim banned people. These are the Guantanamo people. These are the people who took the United States into wars to overthrow countries with majority Muslim populations, whether it's Iraq or Libya or whatever. These are the people who are right now sanctioning Iran so that the Muslims of Iran are barely able to survive this pandemic. So it is, I think, something to always consider. You should always look at the source. And if the primary source for people is what the US State Department is feeding, journalists and so on, I would take pause. I would like to go and look for other pieces of evidence. So that's the first thing. And I said I'll say 3 or 4 things. The second thing is that in China, the second and third is combined really. In China, during Xi Jinping's period, he has tried to drive 2 agendas. One of them is, as you said, poverty alleviation. This is an enormous project. And linked to this, it turns out that about 12, 15 years ago, there was a television show in China which showed these children coming down a cloth bridge going down. And they were, I think, one of the minority groups, maybe in Kunming or somewhere, I don't remember. But they were coming down a cloth rope. And this distressed a lot of people saying, why can't they have a proper way to get to school? This is very dangerous, looks very, very perilous for these children. So the poverty alleviation piece of the agenda was linked to, let's call it modernization. I don't mean modernization in any grand W.W. Rostow way. Instead of a cloth bridge, let them have a metal bridge and so on. But generally in minority areas, because there have been hundreds of years of neglect, is a very kind word, of minorities in the larger Chinese world. This is something that was known to Mao Zedong in the 1950s. He established a minorities commission, and you may know that the first chair of the minorities commission was the Dalai Lama, this current Dalai Lama. From 1951 to 59, he was the chair of that commission. So they've been aware that this is an issue, that poverty and social inequality are combined. And so there has been a long project in this Xi Jinping period to address both poverty and to address, I used some terrible political science terms, but social backwardness. These 2 things are there. And so this has been part of their project in Xinjiang and in Kunming and in other places, in Outer Mongolia, in Tibet, and in other places. Now, add this to the third factor, which is my 4th point. There has been, and I am sympathetic to their problem, there has been the growth of various very dangerous organizations, because I have seen them in Afghanistan that come from Central Asia. The Islamic movement of Uzbekistan, for instance, is a very dangerous organization, which has conducted all kinds of attacks right across Central Asia. There are the Eastern Tata, Islamic movement is also quite a dangerous organization. These are basically organizations that conduct various forms of non-stop insurgency against the population. Now, I've also engaged with the Al-Qaeda groups in North Africa. Many of them are merely cigarette smugglers. So I'm not an Islamophobic nutcase who walks around saying, oh my God, Muslims are organized. Quite the contrary. I've looked at these things with some, interest as a journalist. And I've met some of these far-right radicals. The ones in North Africa, I can say, without doubt, many of them are just cigarette smugglers. Many of the Islamists that one sees now in northern Mozambique were part of the smuggling network of cocaine down into South Africa and heroin. That's what they were doing under the franchise of extremism. But some of these people are true believers, the Eastern Tata groups and so on. And they have conducted quite horrible attacks in Urumqi, in Xinjiang, and so on. And I know that this is a reaction that the government has had to the growth of this kind of extremism. Is it an over-exaggerated response? That is what I don't really know. It most likely could be. Which of our governments around the world hasn't reacted strongly to the rise of various forms of terrorist organizations? I mean, you have Pompeo and Pence going around the world yelling blue murder about what's happening in Xinjiang, but yet they maintain Guantanamo completely without any change, and Bagram Air Base and the other black sites are there without question. So I just find that this is a very interesting way in which this issue has come to the fore. It's also interesting that there are a few spokespeople for the Uyghurs that get taken seriously, and many of them are funded by far-right organizations, and that's another thing I think of interest. So let's have a mission and go to Xinjiang. Let's look at the situation. From what I've been led to understand, it's a very complicated situation, and I'm not prepared to say either there's nothing happening there or it's a terrible situation. I think there's a knee-jerk way in which issues become scandalous, and then the scandal snowballs. Just as a last thing, how this happens, when Saddam Hussein's military invaded Kuwait, there was a young woman who came before Congress and said that they are taking incubators, Iraqi army is taking incubators in Kuwaiti hospitals, throwing babies out of them and taking the incubators back to Iraq. Turned out the young woman who was testifying was the daughter of the Kuwaiti ambassador to Washington, had never been to a Kuwaiti hospital, had no evidence of any of this, and was just basically put there by a PR agency to talk about this. I mean, this is what Washington does. Be aware of that as well.
I know we don't have a whole lot of time, and there's so many questions that I have and our audience has, but I'm actually going to pivot back to India, because I think for us growing up, there was this notion that, okay, there was a lot to be done on the economic development front, but India, the government, there were certain institutions that were developed post-independence. There was a set of values in the public sphere around secularism and freedom of speech and expression, inclusion, social justice, a sense of centralized planning to, support upliftment. So where are we today in India, and what is the hope for the future?
It's a very expansive question. The Indian government, just a few days ago, pushed through 3 bills in parliament. I mean, the first thing people should realize is, even now, 50, 60 plus years after independence, India is largely a rural country, largely. Most countries in this last period, you have seen a shift from rural to urban in terms of population, where population lives. But Indian population, especially after the lockdown, when people have left the cities going back to the countryside, the population of the countryside is still considerable. And a lot of the employment in the countryside is in small farms. It's by agricultural workers who work for, again, small farms or medium farms. And it's people who are day laborers in that. They work construction and brick kilns and so on, ancillary things. Well, just a few days ago, the Indian government rammed through parliament 3 bills that essentially turn over Indian agriculture to the traders. It's a very interesting word, traders. What they're essentially doing is turning them over to multinational agro-business firms. This is going to be catastrophic for Indian agriculture and for Indian farmers and for basically the Indian public, for the people. So what is the situation in India? There was a terrible, terrible riot organized, maybe a pogrom against Muslims in Delhi earlier this year. The government right now is going after those who are criticizing the ruling party for its involvement in that pogrom. They are putting people in jail. Omar Khalid, for instance, a young student leader, was arrested and put in jail. They're threatening other people with prison terms. They're charge sheeting them, as Brinda Karat said today. When she was, going to be charge sheeted, she said it's not a charge sheet; it's a cheat sheet. This is hardly, you're not being straight with what you're doing. But why I talked about those 3 farm bills and then this pogrom is this defines the character of the Indian government and perhaps of the Indian ruling elite. On the one side, increased antipathy to Muslims within India and to China, which is insane for India, because economically, to have a complete break from one of your largest neighbors, effectively, and the largest economy in Asia, is insane. And I say one thing about that. And secondly, to basically go after your own population, agriculturalists, to prevent yourself from being able to create food, because agriculturalists create a lot of food. They're not creating cash crops necessarily. This is crazy. I said I'll say something about this China thing with India. Australia, which is under immense pressure to also have this big break from China, is refusing, because the Australian economy is totally integrated. Australian iron ore mining, 60% of the exports go to China. So the government in Australia, totally pro-US government, nuts government, also wants to do an investigation of the coronavirus, completely nuts, but they can't break with China because the Chinese economy is a magnet, for them. Indian economy is broken with China. It's crazy. There's a joke. India decided to punish China by saying we are not going to allow Chinese apps in the Indian market. And the joke was, what apps will China now say cannot be on their phones? Because guess what? There are no Indian apps. It's an uneven situation. It's better for a country like India to cooperate with everybody, United States, China, everybody, multilaterally, rather than be forced into a Cold War situation where there will be an economic negative impact on India, which we will see. To integrate to the United States right now, where US manufacturing is declining, where the US economy seems to be in a deep trough, unable to pull out of the pandemic, to integrate more with the US at this time and to break with China, which is now coming out of the pandemic, is just demonstrates that the Indian government is less interested in the Indian people and more interested in fealty to Donald Trump. What other explanation is there?
So I'm going to come back to an earlier point you had as to whether people in the US have a constitutional role in the electoral process of another country, and you talked about Bolivia. So I'm going to switch very quickly to Venezuela. Yesterday, presidential candidate Joe Biden made a statement on Twitter, and I'm just saying that this is not a partisan comment on my part related to him versus President Trump, but more just a reflection on US foreign policy. He says, as Juan Guaido speaks about the Venezuelan humanitarian crisis and the crimes against humanity perpetrated by Maduro, I reaffirm my commitment to stand with the Venezuelan people. A Biden-Harris administration will always champion democracy and human rights around the world. So very quickly in the last minute, can you say thoughts on Venezuela and the situation there, and US role in championing democracy and human rights in places like Venezuela?
So thanks to Chelsea Manning, who is an American patriot, who turned over State Department cables to Julian Assange, who doesn't deserve to be in Belmarsh prison or facing extradition to the United States, because he, like I, published the cables. I wrote about them at the time, and therefore, why don't they go after all of us? The New York Times as well, The Guardian, and so on. In those cables, you see very clearly that the United States government, from the day Hugo Chavez won the election in 1998, from then, the United States government was interested in getting rid of that government. So what is their interest? That government from 1998 said that our resources are going to be used to improve the lives of our people and of our continent. Patria Grande, Nuestra America, and all that. This was objectionable. Peter Monk, the head of Barrick Gold in Canada, one of the world's largest mining companies, wrote a letter to the Toronto Globe and Mail saying at the time, after Chavez won a landslide election, a landslide election, which nobody contested. Peter Monk wrote in the Globe and Mail that Chavez is an authoritarian. These people, whenever they see somebody they don't like, they call them an authoritarian, try to delegitimize them, and that's that. This is before any of the human rights organizations like Human Rights Watch, which is, to my mind, a scandalous organization. Its credibility is extremely low. You know, their recent report about Cuban doctors is shameful. And I wish we had time to talk about that shameful report where they accused the Cuban doctors of being slaves of the government. Incredible. I'm doing an event on Saturday with 4 doctors, 2 of them from Barbados, 1 Belize, 1 Jamaica, all Cuban doctors from the Henry Reeve Brigade. And we're going to talk about this. You know, I'm going to directly ask them, you know, are you doing this out of compulsion? And I've met hundreds of Cuban doctors, whether it's in South Africa or in Pakistan during the earthquake. Incredible people, highly committed. It's a disgrace that a human rights organization like HRW would write a report based on nothing. Terribly disgraceful, in my opinion. So in this case, you have a long process from 1998 till now, an attempt to overthrow the government in Venezuela. This has nothing to do with human rights. It has nothing to do with Juan Guaido. It has nothing to do with anything. If the government of the United States is actually interested in human rights, during the time of the pandemic, the US Treasury Department would not have pressured the IMF to prevent Venezuela from getting emergency assistance. The United States Treasury would not have told the Bank of England to withhold Venezuela's gold and plus the US government wouldn't have tightened sanctions against the entry of medical equipment into both Iran and Venezuela. You know, people from the UN complained that they had food and equipment ready in Dubai to fly into Tehran. The United States was preventing any airline from carrying it in. Eventually, the UAE's official government airline flew them because the Emirates said we can't afford to let this happen to a neighbor. That's it, even though they were opposed to it. So what are we talking about? You know, Biden, Harris, Trump, Pence, all of these people are united to the view that we want to get rid of these governments so that our companies can come there and freely mine the gold, freely mine the lithium, freely mine the oil. That's what they're interested in. If they're really interested in human rights, they would have, at the pandemic time, seized all sanctions as a humanitarian gesture. I didn't see any gesture. Instead, what I saw was US warships going into the Caribbean and William Barr, Attorney General, standing bizarrely at a press conference declaring the government of Venezuela, or at least its leading figures, as narco traffickers, when the Drug Enforcement Agency's own report over the last 10 years shows that there's no cocaine coming from Venezuela, that over 90% of cocaine comes from Colombia. Now, because Colombia and the government of Ivan Duque is an ally of the Trump administration, means they don't finger Duque. They will call Maduro a narco trafficker, despite the fact their own agency has not even mentioned his name. I mean, this is what we're dealing with, guys. You know, when they say things like, we've got to get them to go, we are for human rights, I'm not buying it. I'm afraid, you know, it's not from cynicism that I'm not buying it, just to tell you the plain truth. It's from the evidence. I'm not buying it from the evidence. The evidence suggests to me that the United States government doesn't care about the Venezuelan people. If they did, at a time of unusual pandemic, they would have seized the sanctions and allowed medical equipment to enter the country, but they didn't. That means it's not being driven by humanitarian concerns. This is driven by the concerns of profit, which overrun human rights, as we know.
Thank you so much, Vijay Prashad. We are out of time, unfortunately, but thank you so much for joining us today. And thank you to the audience.
It's my pleasure. Thanks a lot.